Whoa, yeah. Children, hold on.
We're subjecting them to long-term sentences where they're in this environment for a long time with very little relief, very little rehabilitation, little educational opportunity, little opportunities to interact with the outside world. And then we turn them loose with absolutely no support on reentry. That runs counter to my idea of public safety and to my idea of justice.
Hello, you beautiful people. Welcome back to the Unbroken Chain podcast. I am Mara James, here with you as always, and today I'm coming at you with a really powerful storyteller and beautiful human. This is Beth Shelburne, who I met here in Birmingham, Alabama. I saw her at several events after I moved here because I was seeking out communities of people who are working on criminal justice reform and helping to tell stories about lives that are really deeply affected by the prison industrial complex as it currently exists in this country. In reference to the documentary that my partner and I are making, Surviving America, which is about a group of men that we met in rural Georgia who are on their own in the world, recently released within the last year after serving 20 to 40 years in the prison system. And Beth is a really bright light in my world, in the world, but particularly in the world of telling these kind of stories. She's pretty high profile here in Birmingham. She used to be a television news reporter and has since left that position and really devoted her energy and time as a journalist full time to telling stories about the prison system. And we actually recorded this when we hung out before the pandemic. And I hung on to it for a couple weeks as we all kind of got our bearings in the current reality. But I think this is really as vital as ever information to share because the injustices that are happening in our prisons are just amplifications of all of the problems that we're dealing with out here, class and race-based harm. And I think the courage to listen to that and to really hear it with a willingness to be changed by what we hear, even if it creates work for us, for the work of integrating information that is uncomfortable or might be incongruous to our pre-existing belief systems. Just the courage to listen and discern what is real and what is true rather than fearing, I think is a really important skill to take us all forward into the world and kind of society that I think we all want to manifest, one based on deep care and compassion for one another. So if you have the space and energy right now to take this in, I encourage you to hang with us today, to really let these stories of people just like you and I who have the courage to do what I think many of us hope we would do if we were in situations of injustice, which is to try desperately to tell the truth and get our stories out in this parallel universe of our prison system. I invite you to let this work on you and be moved also by the example of someone, Beth, who has allowed what she heard to just irrevocably shape the course of her life in a way that really inspires me. I also want to say, too, you can hear at one point her cell phone vibrating during this conversation. She has a second cell phone that the people that she collaborates with on these stories who are inside prison have, and they call her all the time. It's really incredible that she's this one-woman show that makes herself available for that kind of ongoing communication. I want to shout out her articles and some short documentary films that she has on her website, bethshelburne.com. There's an article that came out recently she wrote about Angola, which is the largest maximum security prison in the nation. She is a beautiful writer. I really encourage you to check that out. It was published in The Bitter Southerner. And also, Beth recommended a couple serialized documentary podcasts, which I have binged over the last couple weeks as I've been working on a house painting project. And I want to share them with you. I'm way behind the curve on these, so you probably already way hip to them. But one is called White Lies, which is about an unsolved civil rights murder in Selma in the 1960s. And the other is called In the Dark, specifically season 2, which is about Curtis Flowers, a death row inmate who was systematically targeted over 23 years by a Mississippi DA who tried him in 6 trials. And the reporting from that podcast actually ended up affecting the case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. And I just think it's a really incredible example of the power of storytelling. In that podcast, when things finally start to really come to light, a lot of the misconduct that was being done for years, decades, by the system actors like the DA and the prosecuting team, when things are finally not completely going their way, you hear from a lot of these people that, well, justice needs to play out in the court. It doesn't play out in the media. But in situations where justice is clearly not being served, because, say, the DA has no integrity and is proven to be acting unconstitutionally, who is going to tell that story? And why not the people? Why not Beth? Why not you? Why not me? What does it cost us to listen for what's really happening and to amplify that? You know, there are massive systems in place to keep people quiet and to keep exploitation and corruption rolling right along for the same people that it served since the beginning of time. What does it cost us not to listen to that? Because I would argue that it only makes it easier for those systems to take away the rights of all of us, and that all of us are harmed by that kind of silencing. So thank goodness for the storytellers. I'm so grateful for the work that Beth is doing and for the example that she's providing of how to rise to the occasion. I'm really grateful to be here with all of you and so excited to share this with you. Here is writer, reporter, advocate, Beth Shelburne.
I'm Beth Shelburne. I am a freelance writer and journalist based in Birmingham, Alabama.
So I've been reading a lot of your work, which is such a gift. I'm so glad it exists. And I was really checking in with myself because some of it I was having like a very visceral physical response to. And I was like, oh my God, this is like, I should be feeling this. The fact that I don't experience this feeling means either that I don't have access to stories that need to be told, or I'm like resisting engaging with them. And I was like, that's what allows this stuff to continue happening. So I'm so curious how this became your work, prison, mass incarceration, and what it's been like for you.
I think it started in 2012 when I first started covering the crisis at Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. But I've been a journalist for 20 years and have covered crime. And I've thought about social justice and fairness and equality and issues like that my whole life. But the systemic problems within our carceral state really came into sharp focus for me in 2012. So there was a federal complaint filed on behalf of 50 women that had served time at Tutwiler or were still serving time, alleging widespread sexual abuse by employees. And I filed one story the day that the complaint was filed, and it just sort of opened up the floodgates. My phone started ringing, and I started listening to anyone who reached out to me, and the stories were all horrific. They were all consistent, and I was just blown away by the level of trauma that people experienced in the system, and also it really opened my eyes to the way that the system works very hard to contain this kind of exposure and control it, deny it, and soft pedal the effects of it. I did an interview with the prison commissioner at the time, who's since moved on. He resigned, and he's now working in the Nevada system. But I remember him trying to tell me that rapes were not unusual in prison, and that Alabama was no different than anywhere else, and that he believed the problem amounted to a few bad apples within the system. And then when the Department of Justice finished its investigation and released a findings letter in 2014, it turned out that sexual abuse, rapes, sexual assault, sexual harassment had gone on unabated for over a decade. The women were living in abject terror, and they said up to 36% of the staff was involved.
Wow.
So that was not a few bad apples. And that was something that had gone on for a long time, with many people aware that it was happening. And so that really shocked me awake. Mm-hmm. And it was these conversations that I had with the women who had experienced these things at Tutwiler that really shook me to my core. And they had no voice. They had no power. They had been silenced for so long. And even after all of this was exposed, their trauma continued and continues. So I kind of decided at that point that I was going to, number one, listen to anyone within the system that had anything to say, which was not a common practice in the newsroom that I worked in, or really any newsroom in mainstream media. I think there's this inherent doubt about people in the system, and this idea that, well, they're not maybe a credible witness to what's going on. They've committed a crime. We need to get stuff double and triple confirmed. We need another source. That currency is there always when you're reporting on corrections in mainstream media. But I decided I was going to listen, and I decided as I moved on in my reporting and started looking at the system through a larger lens, that this was something that was so much bigger than one story or a series of stories, and that it encompassed so many different issues beyond conditions of confinement or really criminal justice. It encompasses everything that is going on in our society, from poverty and wealth to literacy to health care to access to mental health treatment. I mean, the outlying issues are so far-reaching that it just sort of took over my life, examining all of this. And last year in 2019, I decided to leave my job working in broadcast media and write about these issues full-time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you feel a responsibility as a citizen and as a journalist in different ways, or is that the same force?
Yeah, I feel a much stronger responsibility in writing about these issues, I think, because so many of the people that I write about or the sources that I work with have no power and have no voice. And I oftentimes am the conduit for them. I'm sort of like their connection or bridge to the outside to get something exposed. And so I do feel a much stronger responsibility in reporting on their behalf. But also I think from just an ethical and moral and spiritual aspect, I feel a responsibility. My mom was a social worker growing up and always, taught me that we look out for the least of these, that everybody has a story, no matter what they've done, that is oftentimes very complicated and involves them being a victim somehow, or some kind of system failing them before they end up being involved in the criminal justice system or on the streets as a homeless person. So I had that background growing up that my mom instilled in me, but I feel it very strongly now in writing about people in our prisons, because they often have no voice, and what they are facing is such an emergency and so critical to be addressed in a meaningful way beyond we are beyond the point of this needing to be addressed. So I know that there aren't a lot of people available to amplify their voices. And so, I hear from them constantly being grateful, and I'm as grateful to them, for allowing me to do this work, because it really is a collaboration with them. And as a journalist and an artist and writer, it's really a gift when you work with people that are willing to share their trauma and to trust you to try to tell their stories to affect change. So, yeah, I feel a responsibility. Sometimes it's hard to sleep at night.
I'm sure you know a lot.
Yeah. I always tell people I know too much now. I know too much. There's too much in my head right now.
Yeah. So this is a big question, but I'm wondering if you could provide a little bit of context for the emergency that you're witnessing.
Yeah, so I think the emergency it applies across our entire system, federal and every state prison system, every jail, every facility that holds people, these immigration detention centers, all of them are experiencing similar issues. But I've come to understand these issues through the lens of Alabama's prison system, because that's what I've been covering and writing about. So we have the most overcrowded and most violent, most dangerous prison system in the country, really in the world, if you want to get really meta about it. And that's not hyperbole. I mean, if you look at the data, we have the highest homicide rate inside any prison anywhere. Last year, we had within our state prisons, 29 people died either from homicide, suicide, or overdose. And that number is really a low estimate, because those are the cases that we know about. Our prisons were designed to hold about 12,000 people, and we have about 21,000 people in our prisons. So I think system-wide, they're about 170% over capacity, but some of the individual prisons are at 200, sometimes 300% capacity. The staffing is at absolute crisis levels. Understandably, people have left in droves because there have been terrible management problems. It's an awful work environment. It's dangerous. There's very little support given to correctional officers. So I'm not sure what the staffing numbers are currently, because the Department of Corrections doesn't publish that publicly anymore. But they are obligated to release it in ongoing litigation regarding mental health care in the prisons. And I believe overall staffing is at about 30% of what is required. So what's happened as a result of our over-incarceration is the system has deteriorated to a point where we have these very low staffing levels, and we have a high rate of illicit drugs coming into the prisons, just totally unabated. Drugs are plentiful, and anything is available for somebody.
How is that possible?
How is it possible? That is a question I've been asking for years, and I get different answers depending on who I ask. If you ask correctional officers or incarcerated people, they will tell you the majority of the drugs are coming in through corrupt staff. Officers that are essentially drug traffickers, working, as a CO for the state of Alabama, but also as a drug trafficker, often in collusion with people on the inside that have trafficked drugs, before they got locked up. So there's a lot of collusion going on between corrupt staff and people on the inside, and then drug dealers on the outside. And what's really insidious about the way this plays out is you have a large percentage of the population that is already dealing with addiction issues and has been incarcerated as a result of their addiction, or things that happened as a result of their addiction. And they are put into a fishbowl where they're surrounded by dope. They are surrounded by heroin, flakka, crystal meth is widely used in prison. And when you are an active addict, and then you are put in that environment, you can't get away from it. There's really no choice. And so a lot of these corrupt agents are preying on people in the system to get them into debt and owing the folks that are dealing on the inside. And so you've got this terrible extortion economy happening now where hundreds of families across Alabama are being extorted by people on the inside who have gotten their hooks into, their addicted loved one who's serving time for a crime, but has become even more addicted on the inside. So because of the level of contraband that's on the inside, the only way that it could be that pervasive would be to have members of the staff participating in the trafficking. And I think that the system has not fully acknowledged that. The commissioner and their head of intelligence and investigations, who I've interviewed numerous times, will try to soft pedal that reality. They'll say, well, contraband comes in a variety of ways. It's thrown over the fences, and it is thrown over the fences. That those are individual bundles. Those aren't like huge amounts coming in. They'll say that visitors bring them in, but it's very hard for a visitor to bring in a large amount of drugs or phones into the prisons. So I don't think that the system actors have fully acknowledged that this is a real problem with corruption that probably involves far more staff members than they would like to know. And then what we've seen is, in an effort to increase staffing, they've created some positions that require less training. So there's something called a basic correctional officer that receives about half of the training that a regular correctional officer would receive. And then they also have what they call cubicle operators. And these are employees who sit in these kind of control centers in the cell blocks, and their job is to control the security doors. And so they're not supposed to have any contact with incarcerated people, but I'm hearing they're having lots of contact because the staffing is so low. Everybody has to, wear multiple hats when they're on a shift. But there's been a lot of concern among veteran correctional officers and incarcerated people about the quality of people that are being hired for these positions. And just last week, I reported that 2 were recently arrested. One of them was arrested at one of the prisons around Montgomery, and he'd only been on the job a couple of weeks. He was a BCO, a basic correctional officer, who had on him meth, synthetic marijuana, phones, all kinds of stuff, alcohol. And so clearly he took the job knowing that that's what the gig was. The other person arrested was a female cubicle operator. And I think that she just had marijuana in her car, so she wasn't necessarily trafficking drugs. But I feel like these arrests are just kind of scratching the surface. And this idea that we can build new prisons and everything will be better is just, it's preposterous to think that new buildings will fix problems that are as deeply ingrained and systemic as the ones in Alabama's Department of Corrections.
It's so disturbing because it just really begs the question, like, who ends up on which side of the prison walls, when the corruption is so systemic.
Absolutely. And, that was one change that occurred within me in reporting on these issues very early on, is I felt this internal shift where, as a TV news reporter, I had always been somewhat deferential to the state, because it's just designed that way. And all of a sudden, in covering prisons, the quote unquote good guys suddenly became the bad guys. And the quote unquote bad guys were suddenly the good guys to me. And, I still feel that way. And that's not to say everybody who's in law enforcement is a bad guy. I certainly don't believe that. Or that, everybody in prison is some altruistic, wonderful person. That's not true either. But I think by and large, what I've seen is the truth about prisons and jails and corrections is largely being exposed by people on the inside that risk a lot to get the truth out. And the reason that they want the truth out is because it's not right. That terrible things are happening to people and it's just wrong. And they want that exposed, even if it means they could be further punished for getting the truth out. They could be retaliated against. I've had people, whistleblowers, send me information that could get them killed. But I think that they feel that strongly about seeing this human rights disaster happening in front of them and exposing it for what it is.
I want to ask you about this sense that I have from a lot of people who are not in prison and who probably have not had a loved one in prison, which is that people in prison deserve whatever's happening to them in prison. And the need to sort of grapple with this question of like, people do cause harm and something needs to be done about that. But does that mean that those people lose their human rights, essentially? Where do you feel like that's cultural, especially here in the South? Is that being reinforced by people on the outside?
I think it's reinforced in many different spaces, and it is definitely cultural and pervasive, especially in this part of the world. I think first and foremost, we are the Bible Belt, and a lot of the Old Testament thinking is that severe punishment is appropriate and just. And so whether that means whipping a misbehaving child or executing someone who's been convicted of murder, I think, a large amount of people that live in this part of the world view that as justice. I have talked to Dr. Wayne Flint at Auburn University about this and just about the history of punishment and the culture of punishment versus justice. And he told me, and it was one of the most interesting and thought-provoking things I've heard in talking about this and thinking about it, that swift justice is sort of programmed into the DNA in Alabama. That we have a constitution that was written to exclude people and to not just exclude them, but to racially terrorize them. We also were a frontier territory, and so the culture in frontier parts of the country is rural ways of thinking, and that the best way to straighten somebody out is to put them in jail, and that it should be swift and it should be severe. And so I think that it's ways of thinking that haven't been questioned because they're reinforced oftentimes by religion or religious background, by ancestors or your, grandparents, parents. And, it's funny I'm not equating spanking a child with executing someone, but when you look at the spectrum of punishment and what is accepted and what is not accepted, there's a lot more on that spectrum here. We have public schools that allow corporal punishment in this part of the world. So your child can be paddled by a school official. And there's all sorts of racial disparities that play out in who gets paddled and who doesn't that we could talk about another day. We had the highest rate of deployment of pepper spray by school resource officers in the Birmingham school system recently in the past decade, which was resolved through lawsuits and court orders. So I think that I agree with Dr. Flint that it is just somehow in the DNA here. But I think what's also in the DNA here is this very rich and beautiful history of resistance. And so that's really what I try to cling to. The South is like a pot of gumbo. You've just got a lot of different flavors and textures, and some of it is really sweet and some of it is bitter and hard. And, I hope that change can come in these ways of thinking from this part of the country, because it often has. It often has. The seeds of change have happened here. And so when it comes to mass incarceration and, these things that we're talking about today, Alabama's prison system is sort of the worst example. It's the example of the worst of what can happen in this kind of system. But I'm hoping that perhaps it could also be an example of ways that it can be resolved or at least exposed. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm working on.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about the habitual reoffender law that you're working on changing?
Sure. They're called 3 strikes laws in some states. Ours is the Habitual Felony Offender Act. So HFOA is what it's known as. It's considered the harshest in the nation. It was passed in the 70s at sort of the dawn of the tough on crime era. So Alabama was sort of ahead of other states in creating policy that was incredibly punitive and was designed to add punishments and enhance punishments for people that recidivated. So the reason our law is considered the harshest in the nation is because of a number of things. One, we have a very broad definition of what a violent crime is. Mm-hmm. So crimes that are not considered violent in other places and by the federal government are considered violent in Alabama. So third-degree burglary, for example, which is breaking into a shed and stealing a tool, that's considered a violent offense in Alabama. So that makes it more punitive because you've got more people in the bucket that are facing enhancements under the law because you've got more people that are statutorily defined as violent. So that's a problem. Another problem is there are mandatory minimums written into this law that are incredibly punitive. So we have a mandatory life without parole, which is, the worst prison sentence that you can get next to death for anyone who is convicted of a Class A offense. So these are considered the most serious crimes: murder, rape, but also robbery, burglary, drug trafficking, crimes that are serious crimes but may not necessarily rise to the harm of a murder. They may not necessarily result in physical injury, yet you are still considered a Class A violent offender if you are convicted of a robbery or a burglary. So if you're convicted of a Class A offense and you have 3 prior felonies, up until the year 2000, starting in 1975, you got mandatory life without parole. Any 3 felonies. So I know guys that have 1 robbery on their record and 3 forgeries. Forgeries that would not even get them a prison sentence today, and they have a death in prison sentence. The law has been amended since 2000, and the mandatory life without parole can only be applied if 1 of your 3 priors is also a Class A. That still means that you can have, say, 1 first-class burglary and 3 priors. One of them includes a burglary. The others are check fraud. You're getting mandatory life without parole. So I think that that's extreme. Just from a point of understanding human beings, I don't know why we would ever want to tell anyone that they're beyond redemption, especially for those kinds of crimes. But that's essentially what we've done. So we have over 500 people in our prison system that are serving life without parole under these parameters for crimes outside of murder. And in 2014, the Alabama legislature closed the only escape hatch that this population had to appeal their sentences. And they did it because the Court of Criminal Appeals asked them to. They were tired of dealing with overly litigious pro se litigants. So indigent people who are in prison that don't have a lawyer, that are filing appeals trying to get their sentence reduced. So they slammed the door on them in 2014. And I've been working to write some of the stories about these folks that got caught in this law. I call them the castaways because that's kind of what they are. They're cast off into this really terrible, violent system, and they have not gotten much attention. Nobody really seems to care about them, and they're really just treading water indefinitely in this system. So we have been hoping to find a legislative sponsor that would float a bill to provide relief to them. And so far, we have not been successful. The governor assembled a study group on criminal justice reform, and this was one of the populations that was talked about in the study group meetings for possible sentencing reform. And then the study group produced a package of bills, and addressing the habitual offender law, unfortunately, was not among them. I was told that they could not get consensus among all the study group members. So I think there's this fear of letting people out of prison, but that's actually not even what we were asking. We were asking to just allow them a chance to file for release. And unfortunately, so far, the legislature has been unwilling to do that.
It seems like debtor's prison is just a very for real thing. If you don't have means, you could just get lost in the system just because you don't have the resources to fight for it, regardless of your guilt.
Well, I mean, and not just lost in the system. I mean, we can look at the case of Nate Woods, who was executed last week in Alabama, that sparked outrage across the world. And the reason that he is dead now is because he was poor. I mean, people that don't normally get excited about the death penalty were really concerned about this planned execution because it didn't square with them that the man who actually carried out the shooting, admitted to the shooting, was convicted of the shooting, is still on death row because he had good representation, so he's still filing multiple appeals. Nate didn't have that. His family didn't have the means to hire good attorneys. His appeals attorneys abandoned him during the appeals process and missed key deadlines, so his case never got the thorough vetting that it should have gotten at all of those layers of appeals courts, and he died as a result of that.
Do you have a zoom out sense of what this is all serving? Like, if it's not serving justice, it's not serving rehabilitation, like, why is this our system?
I think that many of the system actors would say that it's serving justice, that they are working on behalf of victims, and that they are working to get violent people off the streets and to improve public safety. But that's a really narrow look at what is happening. I mean, if you remove someone from society for committing a violent act and causing harm, yes, it does take that person off the street so they can't victimize anybody else in their community, but we're putting them in a more violent community, in a community that, I mean, there's a new word that's been created to describe the prison environment, and it's criminogenic. It's actually creating crime. It creates crime. The environment promotes crime and intensifies it. So we're taking them and we're putting them in a criminogenic environment where they are likely to be victimized in some way. And we're subjecting them to long-term sentences where they're in this environment for a long time with very little relief, very little rehabilitation, little educational opportunity, little opportunities to interact with the outside world. And then we turn them loose with absolutely no support on reentry. That runs counter to my idea of public safety and to my idea of justice, because someone who's been subjected to that kind of torture is obviously going to be more likely to hurt someone else. So I just don't buy into that, thinking that what we're doing is helping public safety, because it's not. I think that there is some political points to gain by talking tough on crime, and that has often driven policy here, unfortunately. So I think that sadly that is a lot of what's happening, is people become subject to the political whims of people in power. And so that's how I see the castaways is, we have people like Willie Simmons who robbed a man of $9 38 years ago and was sentenced to mandatory life without parole because he had 3 prior property crimes, receiving stolen property and I believe forgery or grand larceny, nonviolent crimes. He's still sitting in prison. He has no avenue for relief. And because our officials either don't care or don't have the courage to really think about Willie Simmons as a fully formed human and somebody who deserves every right that you and I deserve, they simply don't address it and look the other way and decide that, we'll just nibble around the edges here and talk about doing these other things, but he can stay in prison. And I think that that's really politics, and it's politics at its worst in a really ugly way that says a lot about who people are serving in power and who they're defending. Our state slogan is, "We dare defend our rights." And I often think, who is we? And who is our? Because it's not the people that are inside our prisons. They're not included in that.
I'm hearing also in what you're saying this thread of just materialist culture too, that we elevate property to the same level as a human life.
Yeah. I mean, it's prison is a money-making venture. And so that's, probably the biggest issue that I have with this idea of new prisons. And I think that other people working within the Coalition Alabamians for Fair Justice that I'm affiliated with also feel if you build new prisons, you are going to fill them up. There's no incentive to decarcerate. And we feel like our fundamental problem is not the buildings. Yes, the buildings are a problem. The conditions are terrible. But the problem is that we have too many people locked away for too long. And that's what we're not willing to address. And so you do have to ask yourself, why is there this insistence that we build new prisons? Who benefits from that? Who profits? Who's going to make money? Who is getting something out of this? Who's supporting this? And there's very little transparency and a lot of dodging those questions by our leaders that make me so suspicious of the whole plan. It's a hard spot for advocates because we see the way that our comrades in prison are living. The prisons are not air conditioned. Many of the conditions are very primitive inside. I mean, they sleep on these steel bunks with an inch thick roll-out mattress. It's like a yoga mat. I know a guy who was recently transferred, and he was living in a cell, and he was transferred to a new facility where he's in an open dorm where there's like 150 people in this big kind of warehouse room. And he was telling me, I said, what's the equivalent of what you're experiencing right now, like for a free world person? And he said, this would be like you suddenly being evicted from your house and forced to live in a loud, smoky homeless shelter. So even though you would think living in a cell with another person is terrible, it was his house. And that was his cellie. They were roommates. They had the drill down. They were able to keep each other safe. Now he's thrust into this environment around a lot of people that he doesn't know, many of them using drugs. The cell block that he's in is infested with roaches. I keep bringing that up when I speak to him because to me that's so horrific. And he said, Beth, the roaches are the least of my worries. He's like, I'm worried about existential threats, not roaches, but the thought of having to sleep with, cigarette and marijuana smoke wafting over you when you're asthmatic and you don't participate in those things and you've got roaches crawling on you and mice in your box getting into your food. I mean, the conditions are terrible. They're really terrible. So advocates are in a tough position because we certainly don't want to say these conditions are acceptable, but the conditions are what they are because we have too many people there. Too many people and not enough resources. And I think that what we'll do when we build new prisons is just transfer all of those problems into a big, new, shiny building with less officers.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. Whew.
I'm sorry. I feel like I'm overwhelming you.
No, it's so good. I'm just drinking it in because I was just thinking, I don't know. It's such an amazing thing to have somebody that has access from the inside.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to talk about statistics, but it's anchored to real people that are your friends. And
yeah. It changes everything.
Yeah.
It really does. And, when you were asking me earlier about this idea that people deserve what they get when they commit a crime, do the crime, do the time, this whole mentality, no one who knows anyone in prison feels that way. Mm-hmm. The whole paradigm shifts when it's your person that's in that system. And I think part of the problem with our system actors and our leaders is they come from communities that are largely unaffected by these problems. And so our policymakers and our people that are deciding what gets funded and what the laws are, they're making these policies that don't affect their families or their communities. And so there's really a disconnect there. But once it's your loved one that's in the system, that really changes. And I'll tell you, I talk to people that feel all sorts of ways about politics. I've interviewed family members that have, pro-Trump signs all in their house, but they are appalled about what's happening in our prisons. And they really feel kind of abandoned by their party. For not addressing this in a meaningful way. They can feel abandoned by their churches because nobody really seems to care. So that really does make a difference when you know someone, or even just if you see someone, if you read a story about somebody and learn about them in that way, as opposed to seeing their mugshot on TV and hearing about the worst thing that they ever did or that they were accused of doing, which is largely the way the vast majority of the public consumes information about people in the system, and it doesn't represent the truth. So I know many people who have committed violent crimes, and they are some of the most wonderful, best people I know. And I'm not saying that they are that way because of their crimes. They are just that way. And many of them atone for what they did over and over again and can get to a place of understanding and self-awareness that is really deep and profound compared to all of us living out here on the outside world and running in a million different directions. So many of them are like brilliant scholars of philosophy and religious studies and really forgiveness, because they have to forgive themselves if they want to get better. And so that's what I have learned from, the people that I know on the inside, is to echo Brian Stevenson, like, we are all more than the worst thing that we ever did. But oftentimes people that have done terrible things are wonderful people. And that is a really hard thing for people to look at and think about. Because
we have to do our own work then.
Right. We have to do our own work. And that, I think, is about restorative justice. Mm-hmm. And we lack that in Alabama. We have no opportunities for that. And it really shows.
Mm-hmm. I really felt that with some of the men that we met that are in this film that we're making, who were in prison for at least 20 years, some of them up to 45, and they are so self-reflective. And some of them say, like, prison is the only thing that caused me to pump the brakes and reevaluate. Like, they say that, but then they did the work, and here they are out in the world still being treated like a capital C criminal. And it's like, what was the point if they actually are out in the world with all these newfound tools and self-reflection, and they have no place to apply it?
Yeah, and a lot of them do the work in spite of their surroundings in prison and in spite of the violence. They do the work on their own. Mm-hmm. And to me, that just really says so much about their person and who they are. I mean, a lot of these castaways have lived under a life without parole sentence for decades. And instead of continuing the behaviors that led them to commit crimes, they are prison elders. They're mentoring younger men that are in the prison. They're participating in programs. Even though they have no hope of release, they're enrolling in programs just for the experience, just to do the work. One comrade that I have has gone through a Vipassana meditation retreat 10 times, where he has gone into the gym at Donaldson Prison in Bessemer, taken a vow of silence for 10 days, and meditated for 10 days in silence. And I couldn't do that. But through that, he has been able to really explore his life before and after prison and why he did some of the things that he did, and his background, which was just appalling, and poverty. He grew up in squalor. He had a single mother who was an alcoholic and a prostitute, raising 4 children, a grandmother who shoplifted. I mean, he was in this incredibly toxic and traumatic environment as a small child. And so by the time he was 22, he had a life without parole sentence for a robbery and 3 prior crimes. But now the person that he is, he's an artist who has developed this incredible talent on the inside. He's a writer. He lives in what they call the Faith Honor Dorm. So this is a housing unit inside Alabama prisons that people have to apply to get into, and they follow very strict rules in order to stay there, but they get a little bit more privileges. Mm-hmm. But these are not the people that are using drugs and stabbing each other. I mean, these are guys that really want to live peaceful, lawful lives and are trying to hold the rest of the prison together. Mm-hmm. And so he's doing all of that and, got his GED, went to trade school when they used to allow people with a life without parole sentence to go to trade school. Even though he knew he would probably never get out, he still did it. And he's still sitting there, and he just turned 58. And so that warehousing of people, in addition to making you wonder about who's making money off of incarcerating him, is just the thoughtlessness and the disregard for other human lives that may be different from yours. That his life is just as worthy as anyone else's. And that's why our leaders really should revisit these laws, first and foremost, I think. But we're trying to convince them of that, and it's an uphill battle.
Well, there's just something so counterintuitive of if we can do that with certain parts of the population, you and I are just as vulnerable. The illusion of our freedom out here is pretty thin.
Yeah, it is. But I also, in doing this work, have become aware acutely of my own privilege in this world and how I engaged in idiotic behaviors and destructive behaviors for, in my teens and 20s. But my environment was different. I mean, I grew up in a middle-class suburb. I was surrounded by people that had certain expectations of me. I didn't have access to guns like a lot of people that get caught in the criminal justice system had. So my environment was different, and really the destruction I was causing was more self-destructive than anything. But I think also the rate that people that look like you and me get arrested is far lower than, the rate of African-American men, for example. But I think that what I'd like to do is leverage that privilege and say things that not perhaps maybe everyone can say. I was having a conversation with an African-American man over the weekend, and he asked me, I'm very vocal on Twitter and Facebook about these issues, and I clearly take a position on them. And he asked me, have you been threatened? Do you get a lot of threats for what you say? And I said, I have, nasty grams, but I haven't gotten death threats or anything like that. And I said, I know a lot of people don't agree with me. I certainly hear from people that call me an idiot or something like that. And then he said, see, that's your privilege. Like you can say these things. I can't. He, as a Black man, if he posted some of the really fiery things publicly on Facebook and Twitter, he works in financial services, that wouldn't be a good idea for him, sadly. So I think that I hope that more people can leverage their privilege in a way to help others that don't have that privilege.
Feels like a responsibility. If we can do it, we have to be doing it.
It does. But I agree with you also that we are all just one bad moment away from being in the same boat that these folks are, because none of us are perfect. And people end up getting justice involved in a million different circumstances and reasons. And, I've done things that could have easily landed me in jail, but didn't, thank God. But I'm not ever going to kid myself that I couldn't be in their shoes. I think that the way that society views me is differently, and the way law enforcement views me is differently. But I am no better than a lot of people that are in prison. And I'm just glad that, I've never been locked up, and I hope I never am, but I could be. And so could really anyone if they want to be honest with themselves.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Do you feel like there's a transmission that comes through kind of universally when you're talking to people who are in prison? It seems so much of what you're doing is just humanizing people, period. I'm sure they want to communicate what the conditions are really like on the inside. Is there other information that comes through?
Yeah, I think that typically when somebody on the inside contacts me, or one of their people, like their mother, father, their significant other contacts me, there's some kind of acute situation that they want exposed or want me to know about, want to get an answer to. But if I establish a dialogue with them and start talking or writing letters or whatever way we work out to communicate, I often find that they want their stories told, the good, bad, and ugly. They want people to see who they are. They want to be seen. There is a guy in prison that wrote me just a tremendous amount of material about his case, and over a period of several years, with the understanding that he didn't want me to publish a story, but that we would just engage in this dialogue and I would listen. And I still haven't written about his case, but I asked him once, why have you told me all this? And he said, because I wanted you to know. And so I think that because they're largely invisible, they are aware of their status. They are aware that the world sees them as the others, and that's not really who they are. So I think that they really want their full story told, not the one that was told in court or the one that was on the police press release or the one that the district attorney says to the parole board or even that the victim tells. Oftentimes they want to have some kind of dialogue with their victims. And sadly, there is no vehicle in our state to provide that restorative justice. So they have a desire to be seen and heard. I think first and foremost, because of the crisis going on, just as a means of survival and exposing these injustices. But when you go deeper, they really want their full stories to be seen and heard as human beings.
I was really blown away, too, by how many of the men that we spoke to really had a sense of their place in some of these bigger systems. Like they understood that foster care had set them up to, join a gang, which then turned into an armed robbery. And I don't think that makes it any easier or any better, but I really felt like they had a pretty big picture understanding of how they'd ended up where they were.
Yeah, the emotional intelligence that a lot of people have, especially people that have done a lot of time. Because I think that a lot of times the pattern is people go into prison very young, and oftentimes they're in a real state of crisis and trauma and addiction and mental illness or whatever else is playing out. But as they get older, if they have long sentences, oftentimes they can get to a real place of understanding within themselves that's really remarkable. I mean, I've learned so much about myself by having these dialogues with people that are working through the trauma that led to their incarceration. One thing that I see kind of universally especially with people that I know very well and have had a long-running conversation with, is they really have to work through some trauma and loss with their own family story. Many of them just did not receive the kind of parenting that a child deserves. And when they're separated from their families through incarceration, they develop, this real love and attachment to their outside people. And, oftentimes that's the one person that writes them or sends money or comes to visit them in prison. So I think it can be hard for people on the inside to think about that relationship and the damage maybe that it caused them in their early life. But those have been some really profound conversations I've had with people and have helped me work out a lot of past hurts and trauma with my own family history. It's really remarkable what people that have been through terrible ordeals can get to in their mind. And it's kind of like a higher plane of being.
Yeah, I have so much respect for it, the work that's being done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any perspective for people who are maybe not touched by incarceration in their personal lives very much of how they can plug into this or get to know people who are incarcerated? Are there systems in place that work for that?
Well, I recommend that people just get plugged into the reporting and journalism that's being done. The Marshall Project has what they call their opening statement. The Marshall Project is a nonprofit news service that just writes about criminal justice. And if you subscribe to their opening statement, it's kind of like the roundup of criminal justice news of the day. Equal Justice Initiative has something similar where you can sign up for email alerts for big issues. There's, lots of resources out there. The Appeal is another media outlet that covers these issues in a really thoughtful and meaningful way that will include the voices of the impacted people. Because that's often what's missing from traditional media is we have law enforcement, the state's attorneys, the victims, and then the defendant says nothing, gets convicted. We run a mugshot, and that's the end of the story. So I think these alternative media outlets that have really become mainstream, like the Marshall Project, are helping elevate those voices. I think that, there are some things people can do that would be a personal decision, like there's prison pen pal programs and things like that. I don't really know much about those because, I kind of just have this ad hoc pen pal, program myself as a journalist. Like I have bags and bags of letters that I get from people on the inside because I think once they realize that you're somebody that listens and is doing some work that can help them, your information gets shared. Mm-hmm. And so, I haven't ever gone through those means, and I wish that I had something at the ready to offer your listeners. If people are interested in the issues unique to Alabama, and you don't have to live in Alabama to be interested in them, there is a coalition of directly impacted people and grassroots organizations, as well as established advocacy groups like the ACLU. And the group is called Alabamians for Fair Justice. If you just Google Alabama Fair Justice, it'll get you to the website and you can join just through email. And so we send out action alerts. We update it with news stories and, just ask folks to be aware of what's going on and to get involved, whether it's through an email campaign or signing a petition or those kinds of things. Mm-hmm.
Is there change that you see happening here that these people's movements are really affecting?
Yes, there is change happening, but it's so slow. And it feels even slower probably than it really is because people are dying every day on the inside, and it really is an emergency. But I think that I have seen the change just in the way the narrative has flipped in our state. In 2012, when I started reporting on Alabama prisons, I was literally the only reporter writing about this stuff in Alabama. Maybe sometimes Kim Chandler would with the Associated Press, or one of the newspaper reporters would. But after the Tutwiler story blew up, there started to be more reporting, and there's been more momentum and other stories that have blossomed out of that, like Connor Sheet's great investigative series exposing the Etowah County Sheriff who was using inmate food money at his jail to purchase a beach house for himself and, do all these other things by pocketing the money. So there's been a narrative shift, I think, and I've slowly seen the voices of the people that say, do the crime, do the time, or I don't care about what happens in prison, get quieter and quieter. And the voices of people who are concerned have gotten louder. What I would hope to see is more people that feel like they can't speak out, like people that are in conservative churches or evangelical churches, faith-based leaders, people that have access to the prisons through ministries or through rehabilitative programs, but feel like they can't speak out because their access will be blocked. I would love to see all of those voices come together. Even people that work in the system, correctional officers, often feel totally overwhelmed by what's going on around them. Even when it comes to sentences, they see how ridiculous these long-term sentences are, but they feel powerless to do anything to make change. So I would hope that those voices would continue to come together. But like for the governor's study group meeting, we were able to, when I say we, Alabamians for Fair Justice, were able to assemble 50 to 100 people to come to each meeting, most of them directly impacted. And we all wore these yellow shirts, so we stood out in the room. And, these were people who had, many of them just come out of prison. So these aren't folks that typically walk into State House meetings. So it was really a beautiful thing to bring them into these meetings and to see the looks on lawmakers' faces. Who are these people? But it let them know that we're here and that we're not going away. And by the last meeting, we were able to have a demonstration where we walked from the Department of Corrections to the State House with about 100 people. And it was really empowering. And that would not have happened in 2012. So I think that slowly there's momentum building behind the efforts of advocates and people that are directly impacted, but it needs to happen faster because of the emergency.
I just want to uplift the courage of everyone involved. That's really so moving and needed. And yeah, thank you for what you're doing. Really grateful.
Thank you for talking about it. I'm glad that for the work that you're doing and that you and your listeners are interested in these issues because they're just vitally important.
Mm-hmm. Where can people find your writing and your films?
I'm on Twitter at B Shelburne. I'm also on Facebook. And then I have a landing page with most of my work, just my name, BethShelburne.com.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for hanging out again, you beautiful people. You can find me online as well at marajames.com and on Instagram at marajames. I also want to shout out episode 61 of this podcast with my friend Damien. If you're interested in hearing from someone that works inside the Alabama prison system and sees a lot of the corruption that Beth talks about, that's, I think, a really beautiful complementary episode to this one. Be safe out there. I hope you're finding joy and you're able to spend some time outdoors in the spring. I love you. More soon.
not the young or old. Life is hard and so unfair unless you believe that someone cares. Someone who's there, rain or shine, sharing your dreams, your heart and your mind. Hold on to your dreams. Believe in love. Let love be the light to show the way. It's gonna show you the way. It's gonna show you the way. And love will shine on you one day. Yeah. Step by step, straight ahead. Though the road be hard to tread. Yeah. What you get is what you do, and you'll find out that love is truly stronger than hate. All you need is your faith in your dreams. It's gonna show you the way. It's gonna show you the way. Let love be the light to show the way. And love will shine on you one day. This old world goes around and round. Sometimes this world can get you down. Just don't give up. Don't dismay. What goes around comes around, they say. And if the sun should fail to shine, dreams are the sunshine of the mind. Hold on to your dreams. Yeah. Dreams are the wings of the mind. You can fly anytime you like. Yeah. Life will smile on you one day. Children, hold on. Whoa, yeah, yeah, yeah. Let love be the light to show the way. Step by step, straight ahead, ahead. Though the road be hard to tread. Yeah, what you get is what you do, and you'll find out that love is truly stronger than hate. All you need is your faith in your dreams. Gonna show you the way. It's gonna show you the way. Let love be the light to show the way. And love will shine on you one day. Children, hold on to your dreams. Believe in love. Let love be the light to show the way. Hold on, yeah, yeah. Life will smile This world is very cold. You know, it don't make no difference whether you're young or old. Hold on. It's so unfair. Unless somebody really believes, to have somebody there to care. I'm talking about through the hard times and the bad times. Sharing your dreams, your thoughts, your heart, your mind.
Children, hold on to your dreams.
Believe in love. Let
Love be the light to show the way.
Yeah, let it show you the way. Let it show you the
Love
way.
will shine on you one day. Children, hold on to your dreams.
Hold on.
Believe in love. Let love be the light to show the way.
Dreams are the
Smile on you one day. Children, hold on
anytime you like.
to your
Yeah.
Believe in love. Love be the light.
You know, like to show the way. Ha, let it show you the way. Let it show you the
Light
way.
will shine
Yeah.
on you one day.
Whoa.
Children, hold on to your dreams.
To your dreams.
Believe in love. Love be the light to show the
Show the way. Let it show ya. Let it show ya.
Light
Let it
will
show ya. Let it show
shine
ya.
on you one
Let it
day.
show ya.
Children, hold
Hang on
on to your dreams.
to your dreams.
Believe in love. Let love be the light to show the way. Hold on, yeah, love will shine on you one day.
Yeah. You know, sometimes the obstacles in life can really knock you down. Yeah. And life will really make you feel that don't nobody give a damn. I know it's hard. And it's cold and unfair. But if you keep one thing in your mind, and that thing is that whatever you do, you can make it. And just trust in yourself and hold on to your dreams, because your dreams are the future of this world. Let it show you. Let it show you the way, yeah.
Children, hold on